The reading I want to share with you today is a poem by Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. And this poem is entitled, "The Slave Auction." The sale began. Young girls were there, defenseless in their wretchedness, whose stifled sobs of deep despair revealed their anguish and distress. And mothers stood with streaming eyes and saw their dearest children sold, unheeded rose their bitter cries, while tyrants bartered them for gold. And woman, with her love and truth for these in sable forms made dwell, gazed on the husband of her youth with anguish none may paint or tell. And men whose sole crime was their hue, the impress of their maker's hand, and frail and shrinking children too were gathered in that mournful band. Ye who have laid your loved to rest and wept above their lifeless clay, know not the anguish of that breast, whose loved are rudely torn away. Ye may not know how desolate our chests so rudely forced to part, and how a dull and heavy weight will press the life drops from their heart. I don't remember the exact date, but it was probably in the spring of 2015, roughly a little bit less than a year after the murder of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. The church I was serving in Philadelphia, historically Universalist church in a predominantly African-American neighborhood with generations of African-American leadership in the church. We had started a vigil to honor the Black Lives Lost in honor of Michael Ferguson, and we had this vigil every week. I'm happy to say, as far as I can tell, it's still going on after all these years. But the UUA got wind of this, and the organization, the group of religious professionals of color who host a retreat, we host a retreat every year for, again, those of us who identify as religious professionals of color. It's called Finding Our Way Home, and Finding Our Way Home was meeting in Philadelphia that year, and they asked her to come to the vigil at my church. And there we were, instead of a ragtag group of 10 or 12 people holding signs for the power and centering of Black lives every week on the street, there were 100+ of us together. And I will share with you, my heart was so full, I could barely speak. And folks honked, they always did. After a while, after a few years, they started honking just when they got on the block, and they would talk to us, and it is an amazing feeling. But the following day, we had what I can only call a privilege. We went to the First Unitarian Church of Philadelphia, a church with a long history of powerful abolitionist movement. Their 50-year minister in the 19th century, William Furness, the father of architect Frank Furness, was a very engaged abolitionist, and he escorted the body of John Brown, the white man who led an assault against the arsenal at Harper's Ferry and was hanged. Reverend Furness escorted John Brown's body in the middle of the night through the streets of Philadelphia because the mobs in the city wanted to tear the body apart. Because of this beautiful history, and we were not there for Reverend Furness, and we were not there for this history, as powerful as it was. We were there because, with maybe only one or two exceptions, none of us in that group knew of Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. even though she had been one of the best-known women in the 19th century in the United States. Called the mother of African American journalism, she was a poet, she was a journalist, she was a first abolitionist, and then a conscience of the United States during the terrors of Reconstruction. She belonged to the First Unitarian Church of Philadelphia. She joined in 1870 and remained there until her death in 1911. We were there because none of us, I said this, but I need to say it again. The memory, the life, the achievements of Frances Harper were lost. I probably don't need to tell you that they were lost. She is not a household word. Her papers, which she deeded to a nephew, he did not survive more than a month after she died. And they were simply thrown away. The publisher who had published her work, she had, I guess, passed from fashion, as so many of us do over time, saw no use in her papers and threw them away. So we don't know what we don't know about her. But we honored her memory that day together, and we grieved. Because all of us in our studies, in our joining this incredibly beautiful faith, this faith of justice and compassion for now 2 centuries and more in this country and elsewhere. We had studied and learned so much about the history of our ancestors, our religious, white religious ancestors who fought for so many things. I treasure that study, and I treasured it then, but it hurt my heart to know that someone like Frances Harper had been forgotten. And it hurt the hearts of our group. 100 years before Rosa Parks gave up her seat on the bus, Frances Harper did the same in Philadelphia. She was orphaned at the age of 3. Her parents were both free black people in Maryland. She was orphaned, and she was raised by an uncle and aunt who were firmly entrenched in the abolitionist politics of mid-century United States. She was educated far beyond the level of most women in the United States, much less women of color, and she became a teacher. She taught. She moved far away from Maryland. She learned several decades later that Maryland had passed a law that even if a black person was free, if they came back to Maryland, they could be taken up into slavery, so she could not return home for the latter part of her life. In, I'm going to say, 1860, she was asked to speak at the largely white Convention of Women's Rights, and the title of her speech was a totally Unitarian title. "We Are All Bound Together" was the title, and during the speech she said this: "You white women speak here of rights. I speak of wrongs. I, as a colored woman, have had in this country an education which has made me feel as if I were in the situation of Ishmael, my hand against every man and every man's hand against me. Let me go tomorrow morning and take my seat in one of your streetcars. I do not know that they will do it in New York, but they will in Philadelphia. And the conductor will put up his hand and stop the car rather than let me ride." "We are all in this together," she said in her speech. "None of this will change until all of us realize that this situation in our country, this travesty, this communal crime, harms every single person here. Margaret Fuller was 15 years old when Frances Harper was born. Margaret's father, Timothy, was a lawyer and a member of Congress for a time, although he didn't have a particularly distinguished career. But it seems clear from her, well, one of her best biographers, Megan Marshall, the book is really beautiful. His most important project was his eldest child, Sarah Margaret Fuller. She dropped the Sarah after a while. She didn't like that name so much, so we know her as Margaret. She was clearly, from a very early age, an extremely brilliant child. And Timothy, her father, made himself responsible for her education until she was almost 10 years old. As a little girl, he would have her stand on the floor of his study late into the night, reciting lessons that were far beyond her years, reciting in several languages that he taught her to learn. He taught her to reason. He molded her in the shape and form of his own intellect. By the time she was an adolescent, she had already lived a lifetime of feeling unloved and uncared for, only expected to endure criticisms. She had a slope in her back because of some spinal birth defect, and she had very poor eyesight, possibly because she read so many thousands of pages at such an early age. And she was never considered particularly good-looking, and unfortunately, as happens to so many of us in adolescence, she developed a case of acne, which really made her father only criticize her more. As she grew older and remembered these times of being made fun of and rejected because she was so very intelligent and knew so much, she wouldn't let anybody see how hurt she felt. I can understand that. Many of us do that, don't we? But she went on to become what she already had been, an intellectual star. She resigned herself to never feeling fully loved, but she knew that in her future she could be valued for her thinking and her writing, and that turned out to be the case. She was the first woman to be allowed to enter the library at Harvard. All of her brothers were able to attend Harvard, but of course she could not. And she apparently noted, but didn't act as though she noted, the fact that all the young men stared at her like, what is she doing here? But she maintained her dignity. A Unitarian as well, as so many of the Boston elite were, Margaret would go on to become a superstar and a shining light of Ralph Waldo Emerson's Transcendentalist Circle in Concord. He appears to have been in love with her, much to the chagrin of his second wife, Lydian. And he wanted her brilliance, her talent for speaking, her talent for inspiring others, to inspire the circle he had around him. Together they founded a literary magazine known as The Dial, one of the most famous essays, which later became a book that Margaret wrote. And see if I can remember. The Greatest Lawsuit was the name of the essay, and it became her book, Woman in the 19th Century, which is widely known to be the first feminist treatise on women in the United States. She went to work for the New York Tribune and was sent an assignment she loved. She was sent to Italy to write about the revolutions in Italy and revolutionary spirit in Europe, and she found tremendous joy there. She was in her late 30s at this time. She appears to have fallen in love with a penniless minor aristocrat named Giovanni Ossoli, 10 years younger than her. He fell in love with her. She became pregnant, and they married. Now, she had second thoughts about marriage most of her life, as you can imagine. Second thoughts is probably putting it mildly, right, Lori? She refused to get married. But having a child gave her a gift she'd never had. And even though her husband only spoke Italian and could not read the thousands of pages she had written, nor speak any other language or any language of the intellect, he was there for her in a way that no other man had been there for her. The three of them, she writes about what a joy it was to come home to a small child, to her little son. And the three of them embarked on a ship to come to the United States, and the three of them died in a shipwreck. All of her documents, all of the resource materials that she had written for her great work of history were lost. She was 40 years old. I'm glad we know her work. I'm glad to have this beautiful biography. I'm glad to have a beautiful biography of Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, written by a white scholar named Eric Gardner. And while we don't have the resources to delve into her character and her personality as we do with Margaret Fuller, Gardner writes not only the beautiful story of her triumphs and her struggles, I'm talking about Frances Harper now, but the story of her erasure, how she was erased from history, which I have to say is something we're experiencing now. We haven't learned. We are erasing the history of our women and the history of our women of color as fast as we possibly can. Both of these women lived courageously at a time when their courage would be punished and called out by almost everyone they spoke to, and yet they persevered. They taught audiences of the 19th century all over what this country was at that time. They taught audiences the value of thinking, of learning, of being educated, and raising everyone to the same level. Frances was an organizer. She worked outwardly. Margaret worked inwardly. She was invited to become part of the abolitionist movement, and she said, "That is not my calling. My calling is to help women from the inside out." But they each made a phenomenal mark. And it's a mark that helps me today, and I hope it helps you today too. Margaret Fuller and Frances Harper put women of intellect and power on the map of this country and the map of our Unitarian Universalist faith. Amen. Ashe. And blessed be